Welcome. Welcome to week 5 of MPAI 600 here at Georgetown University's Applied Intelligence program. Just want to go right to announcements. 21 June, groups 1, 2, and 3 will be briefing at the Zoom conference. I'll give you a link to that, to the Zoom session, and you'll be able to upload, or please give me your PowerPoints to upload, and you can just brief. It's an interconnected system, lets you chat, lets you use your video camera on your laptops, so you can brief in person as well as scroll through slides, so you can actually present your data appropriately to me as well as to the rest of your classmates. So groups 1, 2, and 3 will be going on 21 June. And I'm going to do something a little bit different here because of issues I've had with previous classes. You will upload your PowerPoint to your assignment 2 tab. And when you're uploading it in the comments section, please discuss your fellow classmates and their participation in this. I've had issues in the past where students haven't even participated at all in their groups. Students have just not answered any emails, and they've relied on others, the rest of their group, to carry their weight. I don't want to dime people out. I don't want to make you feel like you're ratting people out, but I do want to know now that if there was a student that didn't pull his or her weight, and I'm talking about blatantly didn't do it, didn't answer his emails, didn't do any research, didn't do anything for the presentation, I need to know that. And again, it's not from this class, but experiences in previous classes have caused me to force you to do essentially peer evaluations for the group project. So if you're doing a presentation, please by Thursday send me the slides, and I expect these to be in PowerPoint format. I also expect you to send them to me the day of, and then upload them to assignment 2 tab. So again, groups 1, 2, and 3 are going. I expect each presentation to be at 20 to 25 minutes. That gives about 5 to 10 minutes for questions. If you're not presenting, paper 2 will be due 24 June, 11:59 p.m. So make sure that you get your paper in at that time. And I'm going to cover some guidance on the paper in this YouTube section. So reviewing week 4, the Iraq, again, 2 case studies, Iraq WMD, 9/11. Iraq WMD, and as you're going through your papers, this is kind of how I want you to outline it, and I'll talk about it in detail in a second. But let's look at the Iraq WMD failure. Failures in collection. I think most of you identified that the curveball was a massive failure in human intelligence. How the information was collected and how it was analyzed and how it was disseminated were really just failures in collection. There are other failures in collection. We didn't have any assets on the ground in Iraq when the inspectors were not there. And that's another massive failure in collection. There was failures in imagery intelligence and false interpretation of imagery intelligence. There was failures in cross-cueing of intelligence. You saw it with the Georgetown section where curveball's data was not cross-cued against imagery data of that facility. So there was failures of collection itself. There's failures in analysis. I think a lot of you brought up that the famous aluminum tubes that were misinterpreted to be uranium centrifuge tubes. Again, shoddy analysis led to that. Others of you have noted that it was groupthink. Everyone thought that Iraq had WMD, and everyone reached that consensus. Everyone thought Iraq had WMD, and they used confirmation bias to confirm all their suspicions about that. You can go down the list of analytical failures that we talked about in week 2 and almost mirror them in the Iraq WMD case study. Others of you who talked about circular reporting. And you could say Curveball was a collection failure, but it was also an analytical failure as well, where one human report was amplified through multiple intelligence channels until it became credible. So that's a failure in analysis. Organizational failures. Again, failures on how information was disseminated. And I think in this case, the organizational failure was George Tenet. And what I mean by that is you saw the documentaries how the CIA director might have been compromised, or he might have tried to please his masters too much. However, if your intelligence apparatus depends on one person and his perceptions and his failures and his doubts, then you don't really have a very good intelligence organization. And that's the massive organizational failure that occurred from 9/11, is that the policymakers only had one funnel, George Tenet, to go through. And then finally, the policy interface, politicization. This is a issue that the Rachel Maddow documentary brings up in detail, and I talk about it in my lecture as well. And the question is, was the intelligence, I don't want to say cooked, but did political interference lead to failures in analysis, changes in analysis, emphasis on things that were obviously incorrect? And that is something that, again, Rachel Maddow documentary covers. I cover in my lecture as well. And that's something that you've seen in multiple case studies as well. So at 9/11, a question comes up, was 9/11 an intelligence failure? I cover this a little bit in my documentary, but I want to reemphasize it. Yeah, not everything that's bad is an intelligence failure. Sometimes you can't see these. However, the fact that there was two known terrorists, Mihdhar and Hamzi, who were on the radar, known by NSA, by CIA, and that was not disseminated down to people who issue visas. It was not disseminated down to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. It was not disseminated down to local law enforcement. The San Diego Police Department did not know that there was voice intercepts between San Diego and Yemeni safe houses. That, I think, is an intelligence failure, that we knew that, and that issue wasn't disseminated correctly. And then the question that comes up, what to do, bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. That was brought up in the National Geographic documentary. I'll pose this question for you. You're the intelligence briefer to President Bush, and you brief that, and he responds, what do you want me to do? I don't know, sir. What do you do in that respect when you get such a vague intelligence information? This kind of correlates to what I've mentioned earlier about a theory in intelligence failure, is that intelligence has to be at least so policy relevant that a policymaker can make a decision. If it had said, sir, bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S., and I recommend that we increase FAA flight level security down 3, where we do double checks on people's ID, and we do more handbag searches instead of searches through the scanner. I think that might have made the intelligence a little bit more relevant than just this vague bin Laden determined to attack in the U.S. I don't think that's intelligence. That's just information, nice to know stuff out there. Organizational issues, and I mentioned it earlier in my first bullet point here, but again, the NSA documentary highlights the issues of overclassification, inability to share information across the U.S. government, and that was a massive failure going forward. That was a massive failure that was identified again in the 9/11 Commission reports, and more importantly in that NSA Nova documentary. And then I always ask, where along the chain could a federal state government have prevented 9/11? And when you think of all the things that you have to do to hijack a plane and to carry out a 9/11-like attack, everything from getting access, getting into the country, getting visas, getting apartments to stay in, which means you have to sign your name to something and usually prove your background, getting flight license, getting access to the cockpit, all those things. If you break the chain, you don't have a 9/11 like attack. And I'll conclude this lesson by saying, I don't think a 9/11, because of all the countermeasures we've done regarding visas and cockpit security and preventing terrorists from having such a base of operations, because we've done all those things, I think a 9/11 right now is very hard to execute from a terrorist perspective. But of course, we still have terrorist attacks, and that's going to lead us to our next modules. But I'll leave you with that for the 9/11 case study. Okay, so guidance on paper 2. Again, this is a strategic paper, and this is for the paper as well as the briefing, where you're going to look at the case studies that we've emphasized, that we've talked about so far. What I'm going to allow you to do is go 2 ways on this. You can choose a case study, either one that we've talked about here, or one that or one that you want to talk about, or you can choose an issue and talk about how that issue is intertwined with several case studies. So if you want to talk about, let's say, politicization, you can talk about that in reference to the confessions and Iraq WMD and Yom Kippur War, and show how these failures or politicization led to these multiple failures. So I'll let you kind of choose one or the other in that. What I do want to emphasize, and I can't emphasize this enough, please do not give me 5, 6, 7 reasons why the Iraq WMD failure happened or the Yom Kippur War. Choose one. Choose one and go in depth on that one. You can write a paper on, certainly a 1,200 to 1,500 word paper, on how failure to interpret imagery correctly contributed to the Iraq WMD failure. You can have a very narrow focus on that and easily fill out a 1,500 word paper. You could easily do a 1,500 word paper on Iraq WMD and the receptivity of policymakers to WMD intelligence. That small aspect. You can easily do a paper on cognitive biases and the confessions of the Norfolk 4 case study. I want you to narrow down your paper, and I want you to choose a failure, identify the failure, point the finger at the failure, and use the paper to argue your points. And again, just some issues that we've talked about. Pearl Harbor, failures in collection. There's plenty of them out there. Pearl Harbor, the inability to monitor the aircraft carriers, the key asset for the Japanese. The Yom Kippur War, we talked about the over-reliance on one source for intelligence and for such a critical intelligence was a failure in this respect. Iraq War, human curveball, which I just talked about a second ago. And again, you can write a paper on any one of these topics and really go in depth. Failures in analysis, Pearl Harbor, again, that was brought up on several cases in the DAL. The confessions, as I mentioned earlier, you can talk about how things like cognitive bias, confirmation bias, contributed to that intelligence failure. Iraq WMD, as I mentioned earlier, groupthink and the desire to force consensus contributed to the Iraq WMD failure. Politicization, policy interface, Iraq WMD, Rachel Maddow goes in detail on that. The confessions, you can talk about the pressure placed on juries, detectives, and prosecutors, and how this forced evidence to be constrained or twisted in a very unfortunate way. And then 9/11, as I mentioned earlier, the inability to disseminate information to policymakers correctly could be, again, almost a topic of a paper in of itself. And then organization, again, these are some of the organizational issues that have cut across several of our case studies. 9/11, the NSA documentary covers this in detail. I just covered it a second ago. Pearl Harbor, and again, as I mentioned in the lectures, there was information collected at the federal level, but it wasn't disseminated down to the military policy or the military commanders on the ground. That is a failure in organization. And again, different organizations, different classifications contributed to that failure. And then finally, the fusion centers. I talk about that. I touch on that in week 4. Arguably, the fusion centers would have prevented a 9/11 because they would have picked up the watch listing, and the data would have been pushed down to the state and local level through the fusion centers, and this would have stopped a 9/11, or at least captured Midar and Hamzi, the person that you saw being arrested in that documentary. So that's a failure in organization. Again, information was collected at the federal level, but it wasn't disseminated down to state and local officials. So that's, again, I can't emphasize this enough for paper 2. Please choose a aspect here. Don't give me a laundry list. Don't give me 15 reasons why this Intel failure occurs. Don't give me a history lesson on the various case studies we talked about. Get down to what you think the failure was, make it narrow, and argue your case effectively. And you'll do fine on the paper or in the briefing. So if there's questions or issues, please let me know. And again, I look forward to your products. And as I've mentioned, again, this class is 8 weeks, so we don't have any breaks for papers or anything like that. We have to keep going every week, and this module is counterterrorism. So we kind of left off with 9/11, and then we go into, okay, the post-9/11 counterterrorism case studies, and we're going to focus on 4. The Fort Hood shooting, unfortunately, I can say the first Fort Hood shooting, the underwear bomber or the Christmas Day bomber, the Boston Marathon, and the EU counter-ISIS. The readings, you have the Fort Hood shooting. Again, that's an 80-page document. Just focus on the intelligence failures surrounding Fort Hood. You don't have to go through every word of the document. Just make sure you have an understanding of the intelligence failure. And then the Boston Marathon bombing, the congressional report. Excellent, very concise paper on the Boston bomber. And then 2 documentaries, excellent documentaries that are just really well done. The Christmas Day bomber documentary, and then the EU terrorism PBS Frontline documentary as well. So that's week 5 in a nutshell. And as you're going through week 5, ask, why do we still have these failures despite billions spent on counterterrorism, despite supposedly better information sharing? Why do we still have these issues still come up? So I look forward to your papers, and if there's any questions or issues, please let me know.